Grew up in a room small as a penny. I was certain of love, but we didn't have money. At the end of the garden, a lawn spread with honey. I was soothed by the pines, it was endlessly sunny. In that cool dark room, I lined up my soldiers and marched them to lands of ochre and cobalt, and read about sailors who dreamed about Jenny, and Jenny had elemental pearls by the penny. I was certain of love, but we didn't have money. Certain of love, but we didn't want for any.
Okay, so welcome everybody to this instalment of What Does the Future Sound Like? My name's Laura Seddon, I'm the creative producer at the museum, and I'm joined by musician Francesca Ter-Berg, and we are going to be chatting to singer, songwriter, composer, general creator, Anna Silvera. I think some listeners or viewers will probably be in the enviable position of discovering your music, Anna, for the first time. So I wondered if we could just maybe start off and tell us a little bit about the musical work that you've been doing during lockdown.
Sure. Well, so my general background is I'm a singer-songwriter and a composer, as Laura just said. And I also from time to time get given these sort of challenges, these commissions. And at the very beginning of lockdown in March, I was approached by a lady called Daisy Lees, and she runs an organization called Arts La Olam. And she specifically asked me to write something that was a kind of response or my own take or meditation on the Mourner's Kaddish. And yeah, it was a really interesting challenge. I'm Jewish culturally. I did go to synagogue growing up on the fun days, you know, like Purim and the Sukkot. But I'm not really kind of immersed in Jewish religious life. But whenever I've sort of had the opportunity to touch back into it, it's been such a enriching experience for me, and one that's really kind of just on a personal level given me so much. And I also feel that through the process of learning about my heritage, there's so much that I can share with the wider community, the Jewish community, in terms of my takes on things, but also the broader human community. Yeah. So there's this Mourner's Kaddish piece that I was asked to create, and that's actually taken up quite a bit of the last few months.
And could you describe your musical process about approaching setting Kaddish? Did you know it well, or was it a big research process? Or
it was quite a big research process, you know. I mean, when I first spoke to Daisy about it, she suggested that she put me in touch with a lady called Rabbi Anna Posner, who is the rabbi at the Norwich liberal Jewish community, because Daisy is based in the East Anglia area. And talking to Anna was really invaluable because she talked to me about her lived experience of being a rabbi and working with people going through the grief process, and also what she sort of felt that the Mourners Kaddish meant to her congregation. I mean, apparently they had a Zoom chat originally where she mentioned, I wasn't on the chat, but where she mentioned to her congregation, you know, this idea of me writing some kind of take on the Mourners Kaddish. And there was apparently, you know, interestingly, a bit of initial resistance to the idea. You know, it's like, you know, we don't want someone to try and replace in a sort of secular way what the Mourners Kaddish is. But of course, as she sort of explained what it was actually going to be, I think there was more of an understanding of, you know, it very much in the sort of Talmudic tradition of commenting and conversing with the text. That's how I saw my responsibility as being. And so that was really great to talk to Anna. And also, I delved into other musicians' interpretations of the Mourners Kaddish, from like Ravel to Ofra Hazard to Barbara Streisand to Leonard Cohen, listening to Sephardic men's choirs and Ashkenazi sort of responses to it, and just really trying to get my feet under the table to try and understand it from all sort of different perspectives. So that was my initial kind of approach before I kind of went into a more personal response mode.
I suppose when I was thinking about our conversation, obviously I feel like I know oracles really well because you came and performed parts of that at the synagogue for us, and there was a particular piece. I've got to get the name right of the track. Tears of Oak, Twisted Willow.
Twisted Willow.
Sorry. And
I know it's a bit of a weird title. Tears of Oak, Twisted Willow.
And my interpretation of that is that it's, and maybe I'm putting words into your mouth, is that it's about that very raw initial part of the grieving process. And that I was listening to an oral history that we've got in our collection of a young Haredi woman who was talking about her experiences in Manchester of working in a old people's home and working with people who were at the end of life and their families, and the level of care. So it's a Jewish old people's home, but the level of care that the team that she's part of undertake in terms of caring for the person who is at the end of their life, from the point of trying not to touch the body too much because they believe that the soul, they don't want to touch, if you touch too much, the soul will leave the body too quickly. And kind of mapping that to legislation where people who are bedridden have to be turned over for their own safety, for bed sores and things. So kind of the line between those two things, and their care of the families who are already, I suppose, in that very initial part of the grieving process. And I wondered if that has a resonance for the Kaddish project that you've just done as well, in terms of COVID, I suppose, especially.
Yeah, so many things to say about that. I mean, I've had my own personal experience of grief and grieving rituals within the Jewish community, that again, as someone that hadn't been really kind of deeply connected to a Jewish community growing up, I was really touched by, and I just think there's such valuable rituals and concepts that, so for example, when my mother passed away, and she's actually buried in Manchester, in the cemetery that's connected to the synagogue that's now the Manchester Jewish Museum.
Okay.
When she was buried, there was this, being at the graveside, and this cutting of the cloth that the rabbi does, and that was really an amazing little detail for me, you know. So for those that don't know, there's a sort of I don't know how to describe it in the correct word, but there's a ritual in the ceremony, in the sort of burial ceremony, where you bring a piece of cloth or some clothing and that's ripped, and there's something about, you know, when you lose someone that you love, there's something so ungraspable about the experience and so incomprehensible. And I think that there's something really special about the ways that, you know, Judaism has these moments that contain and make tangible those impossible to understand moments through an object or an act, you know. And yeah, I love that story about the Haredi woman and this thought that's given to the actual body. And you know, I was also reading about these two different timelines that you have. Onen, which is the first stage of after someone's death, and that's a sort of shock period where the emphasis is all about the actual dead body and getting it buried as quickly as possible. That's the focus. And then once that's done, and this, you know, the soul of the dead is taken care of, then it's the focus moves to this different phase, this Avel phase, which is about caring for the mourners. And you know, this sense of this Shiva, sitting Shiva for 7 days, the Shloshim for 30 days. It's actually this very structured way of forcing the mourner to repeatedly confront this loss and this death in a, you know, held environment. And that's something so important about that, having been through that myself. And the way that, you know, it's part of the conversation, the way that death is, it's not sort of glided over. It's something fundamental to Jewish life, and the frequency of the Mourner's Kaddish getting recited in the synagogue. All those things were, you know, things that I had some lived experience of, but then researching for this Mourner's Kaddish, I really, really appreciated it on a different level. I'd always been really interested anyway in ideas of, you know, the rituals that we have around death, whether it's sort of elephants returning to the bones of their ancestors to touch them and pass them, you know, the elephant matriarch, to, you know, this, I remember working with a Ugandan guy who had been taken by the Lord's Resistance Army, and his family thought he was dead. And when he finally made contact with his mother, he discovered that they'd cut a banana stem as tall as himself, or how he was when he was taken, which was as a teenager, and they'd wrapped it in white cloth and buried it. There's such, you know, there's such a need for these sort of tangible, you know, markable moments and spots and acts and objects. And I do think that Judaism as a tradition has given so much thought to that. Yeah, so that was really, really touching for me to kind of have to really delve into that, you know.
What is the role of music within that act of mourning or act of kindness, and how might that be more important in the future than it is now, perhaps? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely say that, you know, so I wrote Oracles, my 7-part song cycle, which I had the pleasure of performing at Manchester Jewish Museum, alongside Sacred Sounds Choir, who are an amazing bunch of people. And, you know, what I found with Oracles was whenever I performed it, because it was very specifically a response to grief and the journey through grief, and my use of music to deliver myself, to sort of alchemize myself through that process, to be able to survive it. And yeah, I was really just struck by a bit like what Carol was saying, actually, about, you know, sort of post-show for her concerts, that, you know, music does open such a conversation, and people felt like they could really share with me their own stories of grief and loss. And that was so meaningful for me, because that allowed me to feel less alone, and to feel like my individual, personal, very painful story was something far more collective, and something that could be of service and of use to other people. And I don't really know anything more healing than that, other than the actual process of writing the music itself, you know.
During the Wolf of Baghdad, the audio-visual project, for those who don't know, it's a graphic memoir that I drew about my family's experience in Baghdad and Iraq. And it's also an animation. It's mostly wordless, so the music supports the storyline. And when we do it live, it's like a silent movie. You've got the thing showing on the screen, and they've got the musicians below. And after every performance, we've only done about 6 or 7 since I created it. We always have a Q&A, because there are always so many questions. People want to stand up and say things. And there've been so many occasions, like this one old Iraqi guy who stood up at the end of our performance at SOAS. I mean, we're playing in front of all kinds of audiences. And he was in floods of tears. He said, "I'm so sorry for what we did to you." You know, and I said, "You don't, you know, this," but it feels like people feel feel our story, and they can empathize with it. Even if they're not from the Middle East themselves, we have non-Jewish, Jewish, I mean, everyone who comes says they feel it. It's particularly powerful. I don't know if it's just because they're watching images and the music is sort of telling the story. They don't need to know the pieces. I mean, I would do a little description of each piece in the program, so that at least they know the kind of the context, and maybe some explanations of the words if they're sung. But that really does, and it's brought, as I said, it's just brought these disparate communities together to have conversations with each other.
Do you think that this discussion is really vital then, to allow for that space for those emotions to come out, in terms of like caring for that person who's expressing that sorrow?
Exactly.
Is that really vital to the structure of the event? Yeah, okay.
It is, and it feels like they see the pain of the family portrayed on screen who've been ethnically cleansed from their home, and they feel it too. You know, they may come from Manchester, they come from Aleppo or wherever. They understand that the pain of someone losing their home or losing family members or whatever. So music is really powerful in that respect. And it's the connector, especially as I said before. It's got the same, for the Middle Eastern audience, it's got the same sounds they recognize, the same modes and scales.
When I wrote this Mourner's Kaddish this year, I was trying to think of more of a broad perspective, I guess, like rather than it just being specifically my story, it's divided into 3 movements. And the first movement is sung from the perspective of the person who's dying. And I had this image of a hospital room that gave way to this vast open sky, you know, like the lid had been taken off the room. And the second song then was a switch to the person who is waiting for news of their loved one who's dying, and, you know, that wish to be able to go back in time. And I actually took those words, from those first words from the Mourner's Kaddish, but I made it my own. So my words became: sanctify this silence, can you hear me? Magnify these hours so I see clearly. And that was my own kind of use of those particular words, but it was taking it into a more personal, reflective place, I guess. And the final movement of the Mourner's Kaddish that I've written, which is called Light Console Me, by the way, was more of a kind of thinking about the congregation, because Anna Posner, Rabbi Anna, told me about this sort of way that the Mourner's Kaddish can be recited by the whole congregation, or it can be just recited by the mourners, and then the congregation can join them at points. And I really love that idea that, you know, if you felt too alone in your mourning, you could have everyone say it with you. And if you needed to articulate it just with those other mourners, that's also an option. And that sense of, you know, being one of many, even as you feel like you're just one, you know, going through this experience, you're also one of many. So that kind of fed into that final song, I'm one of many, many, we are one.
A thing to discuss anyway in terms of like ritual of death in the Jewish context, but looking at that in terms of where we are now in you know, living in, you know, this new type of isolation, and like connectivity and how we connect, and it's as if like in this ritual, or in all, I suppose it's in all Jewish prayer rituals, it's seems like there's a kind of and all religious ritual perhaps, there's an inherent community involvement, and you can take that and move that into any context. It doesn't have to be in a religious context,
right?
But somehow I always find of all the Jewish prayers, this is the one that resonates with me. Like when I hear people saying this one on mass in a service, it touches me in a way that the other ones don't. And it's something about that collective mourning experience, that you're there sharing it with the person who's experiencing that, and marking it as a community, which is very powerful.
Yeah.
And also because it's in Aramaic, so it's a really ancient form of Hebrew, which also was connected to other languages spoken at that time. So it's incredibly old.
I think that's such an important point, because I think there is, whenever the mourner's Kaddish is recited, you have that sense of layer upon layer of you know, generation upon generation who've also recited that, and that sense of a thread going so far back in time is incredible comfort too, actually. And you know, what Laura was saying about this Haredi lady and all these kind of different ideas around how to treat the body, there's such a specificity to that, that there's such a level of detail that I know that when I have been in that state of grief, that there is some pre-existing structure that, you know, that your grandmother, your great-grandmother and great-grandfather and way back have all, but obviously it's a very sensitive thing, you know. It's like, okay, well, we need to, the priority is to get your brother buried as soon as possible. And also another thing is that I didn't realize was that autopsy isn't allowed in or at least they'll do everything in their power to avoid the cutting into the body, and I didn't know that. So actually ultrasound is I think I'm saying this right, but I think it's ultrasound is the thing that they first try, and if they can't determine the cause of death, then they do have to go. That's probably a legal requirement, that you have to then go for an autopsy if it's not clear the cause of death. But, you know, such a sensitive thing to talk to someone about, and also such a new idea for me, you know, that there is this focus on the body, the actual dead body. And I think that, again, in our society, that's a really uncomfortable thing for people to talk about or think about, the actual reality of a dead body, because I don't think we see dead bodies. I mean, unless you happen to be at the bedside of someone dying, that's it, you know. And so actually, again, that focus on what do you do with the body after it's dead, and that being a kind of, that being something that the close relative has a say in, or the community has a say in, as opposed to, you know, the body being shunted off to sort of an undertaker's. And I mean, I don't know. I haven't experienced other kinds of death rituals, but I really appreciated that, actually, that level of detail as well. Yeah. But Yeah.
And it's really, thank you for bringing this, because it's not easy to talk about, and really, really fascinating, and it kind of gives me another. I want to go back to Oracles Down, do a re-listen of that those tracks. That's
yeah. It's funny how much discomfort there is talking about. I mean, and I think that there is that. Here's another thing that I really love about the Jewish mourning tradition is this idea of the Yazite, of this lighting of the candle every year to honor the death anniversary that we don't really have a word for in English, but there's Yazite. And there is a kind of discomfort about talking about death, and I think it's the fear of upsetting people, but actually in my own experience it's so important. There is that Jewish saying, which is that a man doesn't die on the day he dies when no one utters his name anymore, right?
Wow.
And I really feel that when I get to talk about the people who've gone that I love, or sing about them, for me, that's a form of healing and a form of honoring that I need in my existence. I need them to be present in my life and to still exist in people's memories.
Oh, these nights we have come.